Thank you very much, Tom. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'd like to tell you what I've honored it to be part of this beautiful conference. Not only that, ever since I was very young, I was a gigantic fan of Albert Einstein. But to be here in the Einstein room is an honor and privilege beyond description. I'm going to share a story with you that has to do with my kind of awakening to the deeper science of consciousness beyond a lot of how I was trained back in the 70s and 80s, very much in the traditional, conventional materialist, the physicalist tradition. And that would be the notion that the brain creates consciousness, and when our brain and body die, that's the end of conscious awareness. And to me, as a practicing neurosurgeon, that seemed to fit some of that, but there were many exceptions to that, things that demanded my attention to look at a much bigger picture. Now, I had grown up in a scientific family. My adopted father, that's very important, I was adopted. My birth mother was 16 and unwed, and I was in a little baby dorm for about 4 months before I was adopted. And my near-death experience story had a lot to do with resolution of some of the abandonment or the trauma of that adoption history. And I would say that it's important to acknowledge here, that people sometimes claim that things like NDEs do not contribute to our knowledge about reality because they're just anecdotes. But I would submit that every development in science has started as an anecdote. And I would also put out there that when the topic is something as closer to us as consciousness, given that none of us has ever known anything other than be inside our own consciousness, this leads to some kind of fascinating possibilities and discovery through something like a near-death experience. Now for me, that near-death experience happened back in November 2008. I'm almost 17 years beyond it, but I'm still at the early stages of unpacking it, trying to understand what it means. But as a scientist, whatever conclusions I come to, it needs to fit within a rigorous scientific framework. My NDE was in the setting of E. coli, bacterial meningoencephalitis. So the worst kind of meningitis you can have. It drove me into coma within about 3 hours. And that in itself is a terrible indicator. My doctors suspected when I first hit the emergency room, already seizing and comatose, that I had about a 10% chance to survive. By the end of that week, it was down to 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And it was a few hours after the doctors held that conference with the family saying it was time to stop the antibiotics and let me go, that I started coming back to this world. As I did, my brain was still very much savaged by the meningitis. So that even when I woke up and was fighting the ventilator and pulled out the tube and I said, thank you, my mother, my sisters, my sons at my bedside, I did not recognize them. The reason was I had an extreme amnesia during my NDE. And don't worry, I haven't ever heard this happening to anybody else in an NDE, but I think in my particular days, it was necessary for me to get the reality of what was going on, to have that amnesia. And in fact, to lose all my prior memories for this NDE, come back to this world with those memories still deleted, but over 2 months have everything returned. Now in our book that I co-wrote with my wife Karen Newell, Living in a Mindful Universe, we have a big discussion about how memory is not even stored in the brain. It's kind of the last nail in the coffin of materialist neuroscience, but it has to do with the fact that there's way too much evidence that memories are not stored there. Neurosurgeons have suspected that for a long time because there's never been an operation where we moved part of the brain and had a simultaneous deletion of some long-term memories. And you can mess up conversion of short-term to long-term memories by operating on or having pathologic damage to the medial triple lobes, entorhinal cortex, hippocampus, those structures. But that's not the same as finding the ultimate site of memory stored. And that's very important because the brain is also not the creator of consciousness. What I'll be putting forward is an argument that it's a filter. It used to be in the late 1800s, the era of William James at Harvard in psychology, that he even used the technology of the day, the steam engine, for their metaphor. And they said the brain was a reducing valve. Now they say we use the metaphor of a computer. But I promise you, the brain is no more a computer, into a computer, than it is a steam engine. So we use these analogies, but they don't even begin to encapsulate what's going on with the brain and mind and the major consciousness. I think the main thing that got my attention during my near-death experience had to do with that birth trauma of the adoption of Anne woman. And that has to do with the fact that the spiritual guide that I encountered, and I wrote all this up in a book called Proof of Covenant, but that spiritual guide was absolutely astonishing. She was the most beautiful part of the experience. And yet when I came back to this world, I did not know who she was. And I never read the near-death experience literature before, but as I go deeply into it, I realized that that spiritual guide is supposed to be somebody important to you in life. And yet I knew her so well because of this mind meld that we shared during the experience, where she reassured me, not in language, but in pure conceptual flight, that I translated later into the words, "You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for." And I cannot tell you, in this extreme kind of ultra-real world that I was going from in this spiritual experience, how powerful that message was. And by finally discovering her identity 4 months after my coma, and that she was deeply related to me through that birth family history, but had left the physical world 2 years before I even found out about her existence, all but started to fall into place. And in fact, it's that recognition, because of a picture sent in the mail from my birth family, that I finally recognized her 4 months after my coma. And the shock of that moment of recognition brought me to my knees. Couldn't even stand for 30 minutes. It was an absolutely astonishing revelation to me. But ever since that proof, that the reason this whole journey seemed way too real to be real was because it really happened, but not in the physical world. That's what has driven my kind of further investigation and going into all this. Now, it turns out that meningitis in many ways is a perfect model for human death. Here's a medical case report on my medical records. It's very important. Case report was written by 3 doctors not involved in my case, but absolutely fascinated by my recovery. And it appears in the Journal of Nerves and Mental Disease in September 2018. It's written by Dr. Sergey Khan, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. And they basically make a very clear case that my brain was far too damaged to these kind of global destruction from the meningitis, including my brainstem, not just the neocortex, but it was full thickness damage with a tremendous amount of swelling in the deep white matter. There was no place in that brain for a dream or hallucination to occur, much less the most profound, fascinating, detailed, memorable, and transformative set of experiences I've ever had. That all happened in a period when my brain was documented to have a horribly damaged neocortex. They could not do that. And not only that, but also the peer review editors of the journal challenged these authors. How will you explain this case? It's unprecedented in the medical literature for somebody to be that sick from a brain-negative bacterial meningitis and then end up making a full recovery. And they said, it's because he had a near-death experience. And that was good enough for the scientific review editors. Okay, now we have an explanation. They knew other cases of miraculous healing in near-death experiences, like an Eben Alexander, stage 4 lymphoma, vanished after her NDE. And Dr. Mary C. Neal got an over 30-minute warm water drowning. Brought to the surface dead, but then ended up making a full recovery. So in other words, just the identification that these rich spiritual journeys that occur at a time when the brain is incapable of mustering any kind of dream or hallucination should tell us something about our relationship with the universe at large, our powers as willful beings to actually manifest through our free will something of the life we came here to live. And I think that my NDE was certainly part of the reason I came to this world. There are other challenges and hardships I had in my life that I also see as tremendous gifts. That's a very important point, is that the hardships and hurdles and illness, injury, all these kind of things in many ways invite us to grow into the soul we came here to be. And it's how we respond to those hardships that really have me defined where all this is headed. So my NDE provided very direct evidence to me that the brain is not the ultimate producer of consciousness, But then how do we start to explain much more of what's going on with this? And that's where I can tell you that I found several touchstones in my journey that have been very important to help me get to some answers. One of those touchstones was a beautiful paper with one-page essay. It was in the esteemed scientific journal Nature back in 2005. It was by Richard Kahn Henry, who's the head of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins, certainly knew his way around physics and cosmology. And in his one-page essay entitled The Mental Universe, he makes it very clear that the universe is primarily mental and spiritual. Enjoy! Exclamation mark. That's how he ends the essay. But what he's pointing out is that quantum physics was directing us to very seriously question that materialist notion of brain-created consciousness. And I would say that much of the additional evidence has come informed that, in fact, my wife, Karen Newell, and I put together a book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And that book is based on what's called consilience. Consilience is the notion that if you look at a deep problem from many widely different directions, and they all tend to take them in the same direction, then maybe you should pay attention to it. Now, the first ingredient in this consilience argument, I would say it's the hard problem of consciousness. That was first defined by David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher in the mid-1990s, in his book, The Conscious Brain. But he presented extreme challenges to the materialist interpretation of the brain-mind relationship that to this day have really dominated the discussion among many neuroscientists. The hard problem. Now, there's an easy problem. The easy problem is the relationship of neural activity to phenomenal perception, like the redness of red. Now, the easy problem is one that many neuroscientists agree to take about a century to solve. That is qualia, the relationship of neuronal activity to these perceptions. That should give you some idea of what the hard problem's all about. And it is a very deep problem. In fact, I would say it's a complete rebuttal of materialism. We need a better model, and that's what we are working towards now. So you've got the hard problem of consciousness in neuroscience as a starting point for this consilience. Then the binding problem in philosophy of mind, that is the apparent unity of consciousness in an individual. You know, that everything that you see and smell, sense, body awareness and state, relationships for those around you, memory of the past, executive function, projection to the future, every bit of that, is accomplished as if it's this for one consciousness. And the interesting thing is, there's an extreme challenge to the materialist community. In other words, to say how this neuronal population in vision, this neuronal population in auditory cortex, this neuronal population in movement is involved in memory of past events, that they all have this unity. It's a real deep challenge, and yet it makes far more sense if consciousness is unified from the get as it comes through this filtering thing that we call the brain. Now then there is all the evidence from parapsychology of non-local consciousness, consciousness outside of the brain to be demonstrated in a scientific fashion. Now, one example is telepathy. Many of us have had telepathic experiences. It turns out if you study identical twins, because of their genetic overlap and because of their kind of resulting overlap of nervous systems, they seem to have the ability to know what the other is thinking at a great distance. You can have a twin touch a hot stove and the other twin 1,000 miles away, like feel pain and develop a blister. In fact, a very good friend of ours, a very good colleague, his name is Dr. Larry Dossett. He's written extensively, a brilliant physician. He was an identical twin. He and his identical twin buried two identical twins. They had a lot of telepathic experience in that. And he actually wrote a book called The One Mind, which I highly, highly recommend. It's very much aligned with our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, to serve as proof for this primordial consciousness and how our brains work as a filter to reduce it all down. So telepathy is a very clear example of non-local consciousness that humans share. I know when I went to call my birth father, who I had finally met 1 year before my call, and we spent much time kind of back and forth with each other, but hadn't seen each other for about 3 months when I went to come. She came back from a business meeting and knew that something was horribly wrong with me. Called the family and found out that morning I'd been admitted to an ICU with meningitis and might not live. So that's a telepathic connection between my birth mother and I, even though we spent the first 54 years of our life apart. Now, there's also remote viewing. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, remote viewing, they call it pseudoscience. That is, Wikipedia is a pseudo-encyclopedia. I would not recommend we use it for anything, much less for any of these spiritual topics. And even though they say that, remote viewing was reviewed by Jessica Utz, who is the president of the American Statistical Association in 2015 when she was president. And she was basing her talk on 20 years of research that she'd done reviewing information on remote viewing, which is a way of using the mind to see information at a distance and across time, but then intelligence services around the world would use remote viewing to discern, those kind of high-value targets. But Jessica Utz said that, in fact, the chance that all of those results would line up the way they did, the p-value was less than 10 to the minus 20th. That is pretty darn significant. So, and she said if it were anything less kind of debatable, like the spiritual and religious natures of consciousness, but were more mundane, that scientists would have accepted long ago that precognition and remote viewing are very real parts of human existence. And then, of course, you have quantum physics. And you've heard plenty about quantum physics this morning. I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about this, although we'll hit some specifics in a few minutes about why it's important in this discussion. And I would simply point out that quantum physicists going back to Erwin Schroeder, Pascal Jordan, Max Planck, and others, all made statements about how consciousness seemed to be something primordial, that it wasn't so obvious that it was what the materialist said, just kind of a version from brain and involving global things, but had a lot more to do with mind and free will, and how scientists, set up experiments and things like that. You start to realize that there's a deep message in quantum physics about consciousness. Now, I know there are plenty of quantum physicists that would say, wait a minute, no, we move beyond that, but allow me to continue. I will also point out that quantum physics, when I came through, in college in the 70s, in med school in the 80s, that kind of thing, quantum physics was thought to be only applicable at extremely low temperatures. Quantum effects were things that happened within a few degrees Kelvin. Well, since that time, we found that, in fact, in biological systems, quantum physics is very important. You cannot deny it. For example, photosynthesis, right there at the bottom of the food chain for all life on Earth. Photosynthesis is a quantum tunneling effect. The efficiency with which the electron moves through the chloroplast is very much dependent on those tunneling effects and have nothing to do with classic physics. So that's referring to the world of biology. They have photosynthesis. Likewise, the human sense of smell is something that's been shown to be dependent on quantum tunneling effects for its incredible variety and spectrum of operation. And you even have things like bird migration, like the European robin has been examined scientifically, and they find that the bird can actually see the Earth's magnetic field with their eyes. Now, they don't see it pole to pole. They see it pole to equator. But it doesn't matter. They can use that for navigational purposes, and that is the quantum tunneling effect. So quantum physics is definitely alive and well in the warm, wet biological world that we inhabit. The big question, of course, is what about consciousness? And to kind of get to that, I would refer back to the history of physics at this illustrious university, Princeton. John Archibald Wheeler, who was head of physics here for many years, from like the early 40s into the mid 70s. And Wheeler came up with what was called the participatory anthropic principle. And that was his response to kind of quantum physics observations, and very specifically in a discussion about an extremely elaborate experiment called the delayed choice quantum eraser. And in fact, Wheeler, in trying to explain that, he cited himself with an idealist, George Berkeley, the Irish theologian who lived 200 years earlier. And Wheeler quoted him as saying, to be is to be perceived. And that it was really the perception that was the important thing. Now, in Berkeley's telling this, it was more of a solipsism, this idea that you have a mind, all you do is that your mind exists. You surmise that these other minds exist and this world exists, but the only thing you know for sure is your mind exists. And I think that the the idealism that we're referring to there, that is the primacy of mind in the session of what happens in this world, is something that we and others today, especially the argument I'm making, is not so much one of solipsism, but one of one mind that we share. And it's a God mind. That's what we come in touch with in near-death experiences. I would point out that of those people who have near-death experiences, and there have been millions of them, that 90% plus come back to this world, not only believing in a God, but knowing in the reality of a loving, intelligent force at the core of the universe. What I discovered on my journey is it doesn't matter if you want to call that force God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao, to the many words humans have attached to this kind of perception that we get to when we're no longer in the shackles of the brain and the body, but in that process of dying and leaving this world, there's this incredible kind of sense of connection and understanding, and all of this is something that I think lends itself tremendously to this kind of discussion. A few other things I'd like to close on this before I get to the final part of this is in looking at brain-mind relationship. I know there was some discussion earlier today that basically pointed out or tried to establish that neurons and ions and the neurotransmitters, they're all working at a quantum level. These are all atomic, molecular, and subatomic particles. And it turns out that there were big arguments back in the mid and late 20th century about those being kind of billiard balls, Newtonian determinism. And one thing that Sir John C. Eccles, who's an Australian neurophysiologist who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology in, I think, in 1963. But anyway, he did all his work on ion channels and synaptic vesicles, clearly the realm of quantum physics, and found that, in fact, and he describes all this in a book that he wrote that was published in 1994 called How to Self-Control the Brain. But he showed that all the arguments people had about conservation of energy problems with how you inject free will into a brain, that in fact, none of those energy considerations were relevant because all of the no fire decisions of synaptic vesicles, ion channels, things like that were made with a very tight confinement of ions. And as we know in quantum physics, one of the deep principles is the more you know position, the less you know momentum. And in fact, what Eccles showed is that that extreme tight confinement in spatial localization allowed for a tremendous opening of the momentum vector. So the decisions of whether or not the neuron even fire were something that were not at all determined by Newtonian determinism, but in fact had much more to do with quantum effects. And that's where I think it's important to start paying more attention, use quantum physics and its role in consciousness. And I love how Eccles said, he said, I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism, the notion that if we keep studying the materialist side of this, that we'll ultimately get to the answers. And he's saying, no, you won't, because there's too much else going on. To account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classed as a superstition. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in the spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world. And to me, that says a lot about where we're going. It turns out that, in fact, neuroscientists, even back in the mid-1970s, had a big clue as to what I'm talking about now, about this primacy of mind. Particular example is Wilder Penfield, very respected Canadian neurosurgeon. And at the end of his career, and he probably had more experience stimulating the brain in awake patients than anybody else in history. Now, I've done a lot of those cases myself. I know how they feel a lot to us about the brain-mind connection, but I defer to Penfield's wisdom as such a respected neurosurgeon. And he made it very clear in his 1975 book, The Mystery of the Mind, that you could not explain the workings of mind solely upon what's going on in the brain. And in fact, he was very grateful as a materialist neuroscientist that he could now awaken to the reality of this kind of notion of spirituality and that we're spiritual beings. And he could revel that we're not just some cold mechanistic, beat robots. And sadly, Penfield had recently been diagnosed with cancer, and he passed from this world soon after that book was published. But the reality is we've got a lot more information since that time. A lot of the information that I've talked about in terms of quantum physics, of parapsychology, non-local consciousness, etc., to help us come to a much more sophisticated understanding of the brain-mind connection and the nature of our existence. But one other piece I'd like to inject into that discussion of quantum physics is the work of George F.R. Ellis. He's a South African mathematician. He's written extensively about top-down causation, especially in quantum systems. And I think that's actually what we're dealing with here. I already mentioned the unity of consciousness and the binding problem, and how vexing that is to materialist neuroscience. But in many ways, I think what we're seeing is this kind of top-down organizational principle applied to our lives, to our brains, to how all this works. So that looking at one consciousness, and kind of one mind, this God mind that I'm talking about, as something that's filtered through our brain, is something that makes a lot more sense. But the interesting thing is that has tremendous implications for what happens when we die, and many other kind of observations that go beyond what I'll be discussing today. For example, some of the observations about past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation. But all of it is kind of opening us to this notion, kind of a grander sense of what mind really is and what its relationship with brain is. I'll point out that, to me, entanglement is a huge part of this. Entanglement of quantum particles and wave functions, as we heard earlier, led to a Nobel Prize in 2022. And that was, when you think about it, entanglement is actually the Nobel Committee's statement that we're no longer slaves to what Einstein believed in, local realism. And the local is the fact that all physicists start to all particles interact with each other locally, like the photon from a distant star touches the retina of my eye in the time of wearing it. So it's all local physics, particles touching. The realism part, as was discussed earlier today, is that there's an existing physical reality independent of observation that exists before the observation. And as it was so eloquently presented right before lunch, that's not the case. In fact, as Pascal Jordan said, not only do we make observations to reveal the world, but in fact our observations generate that emerging reality. And I think the main things to finish off around the near-death experience is just to kind of share the power of that kind of clinical observation. One thing I'd mention is near-death experiences have been described in people who are blind. And in fact, Ken Ring wrote a book about 30 years ago called Mindsight, which involved not only people who would become blind, but people who are born blind. And what he was able to demonstrate is during the near-death experience, they can see and they can describe things that they couldn't possibly describe if they didn't have some way of seeing it. So it kind of elevates your interest in NDEs and what they're telling us about the nature of reality. Also, I would point out the phenomenon called terminal or paradoxical lucidity. As somebody gets close to death, in many cases, it can be somebody who's been in coma for weeks or months. In fact, some of the early cases were some schizophrenics who have been completely non-communicative for decades. And yet, as they approach death, it's like their soul comes back into them, like it's wisdom, it's reflection, their ability to communicate with loved ones at the bedside, and then they pass in this world. In the book Proof of Heaven, I have one example of this kind of terminal lucidity, and it happened to a good friend of mine who happened to be the chairman of one of the top neurosurgical programs on Earth, and he was with his own father when he passed, and the father was clearly witnessing the soul of the grandmother of my friend that would be this patient's mother, who he'd been with during the Holocaust. When he was 14 years old, she had died in a concentration camp. So he had never talked about her. And now here he is on his deathbed. He's been pretty much comatose for about 4 weeks due to his medical condition. But at the end, he wakes up, he's looking at the foot of the bed, and my friend was absolutely convinced that he was witnessing the soul of his departed lover. And it was only when my friend heard my story that he started making sense that it actually really occurred. The evidence that I mentioned for the afterlife, the scientific evidence. You know, our book, Living Life, the Universe, does quite a job of getting you in that direction. But another resource I would like to share is BigelowInstitute.org. And if you go to that website, we'll find 29 essays that were all written by scientists who had at least 5 years of research experience studying the afterlife question. And those 29 essays go a long way towards making the case very clearly that there is an afterlife. And some of the papers are extremely scientific, in particular the one by Bernardo Castro, who is kind of an emerging modern idealist. I think is a very well done paper that really uses only the observations of quantum physics to come to his arguments about the primacy of consciousness. So it seems that Sir James Jeans, back in the mid-20th century, really had it right. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather to hail it as the creator and governor of this realm. And mind, spirit over matter is something that in medicine we're very used to. Placebo effect is kind of a starting point. Placebo effect, although many people think it's just a sugar pill fixing a headache, it turns out that when you look at placebo effect in a much grander way, you start to realize that we have a tremendous power to heal ourselves. In fact, we start to wonder how much of that healing is actually due to the substance or medicine or procedure that's being investigated. But placebo effect is a beautiful example of mind over matter. And then in healing, you can move beyond that to what are called spontaneous remission cases. For example, at noetics.org, you can find a book, put in spontaneous remission as a search term. That book was written in the mid-90s, but it has more than 3,500 cases of people who basically cured cancer, infections, sometimes even curing congenital deformities, things like that, through various processes of mind over matter and various practices. These are all people who have failed conventional medical management. So we're getting to the point where I think an admission of the power of mind and the fact that mind is not simply something associated with a 3.5 pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm bark bath between our ears, but that mind is something much more than that. I would submit we're sharing the mind of the universe. The universe is self-aware, and so we're finding more and more how we can interact with that. For me, that program of interaction involves meditation and centering prayer. These are all ways, once you realize that mind is not just this little local phenomenon in your brain, but shares and overlaps with a lot of the rest of the universe, that's where we can really gain some power in manifesting our free will. So I think to close, the consolidating worldview that in many ways coalesces our ideas around near-death experiences, shared death, so many other of these kind of examples that define materialism. These are really leading us in a very promising direction. I would point out that from my perspective, Homo sapiens means wise. Well, yeah, when I look back on the last 2 or 3 centuries of scientific growth, I see a lot of wisdom. I see a lot of communications, transportation, medicine, things that have been transformed tremendously through scientific effort. I also see the chemists committed their sins in World War I with the development of machine guns and poison gases and explosives. The physicists committed their sins in World War II with the development of nuclear weapons. I don't know if we'll have a World War III, but I promise you if we do, World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. That's a paraphrase of Albert Einstein. And I would say that a lot of the problem in modern science, and this includes not just what I just mentioned about nuclear war and conflict and all that, but also our addiction to fossil fuels and the kind of corporate greed and anti-industry and leading to global warming, or kind of mishandling of this world. That does not suggest wisdom to me. And I would say that this revolution that I think is coming in the scientific and in the world community, that acknowledges the oneness of mind, where we're all bound to those forces of love, kindness, compassion that are so prominent in NDE accounts. This is the remedy that will take us away from kind of toxic stew of our modern polarized environment and much more towards a world of peace and harmony by acknowledging the scientifically validated reality of this primordial mind and the binding force of love. Thank you so much for your attention.